Before I briefly introduce the speaker, let me mention my gratitude, our gratitude to the Center for the Study of Europe for funding for this event with help from two colleges, Family, Home, and Social Science and the College of Humanities. My friend Alan Levine received his PhD from Harvard University from the government department, and he specialized in political theory. He's been teaching at American University for 17 years, where he is also director of the Political Theory Institute that hosts many very interesting speakers, conferences, debates. They do a lot of good work connecting political theory with very live policy questions. I'll mention just a few of Professor Levine's publications. He has a book on Montaigne called Sensual Philosophy. He's edited recently a volume called A Political Companion to Ralph Waldo Emerson with many interesting essays, and also another volume called Early Modern Skepticism and the Origins of Toleration. It's a great pleasure to have Professor Levine on the BYU campus, and please join me now in welcoming him.
Well, I'd like to, I'm sorry, I'm recovering from a cold, so my voice is a little hoarse. But I'd like to thank Ralph Hancock for the invitation out here. And for those of you who have studied with him or have not yet, take advantage of the opportunity. Ralph is really one of the world's leading political theorists with a terrific book that just came out that I had the pleasure of reading and reviewing. And it's a particular pleasure to be here and talking about the idea of America at Brigham Young University, where this community has taken advantage of America and embodied the American dream in a more profound way than just about anyone else. So my topic is on European philosophers' views of America. Right? So it is not on America per se, and it's not about American political thought, right? It's European views of America. So America is the other being viewed that way. And if you're familiar with sort of postmodern stuff, America is often accused of not taking into account the other. In this talk, I'm putting a twist on that. We are the other. America is one of the great symbols of all time. It's perhaps on the short list of the great, probably the greatest philosophical political symbol of modernity, and on the short list of great symbols right up there with Athens representing philosophy, Jerusalem representing biblical religion, Rome and its pagan and Catholic senses, and maybe Mecca. But what does it stand for? Roads paved with gold, city on a hill, the great Satan, Michael Jackson, Madonna, blue jeans. There's another very different view of America, comes from, and this is from a French writer named Henri de Montherlant. And he wrote, "One nation that manages to lower intelligence, morality, human quality on nearly all the surface of the earth. Such a thing has never been seen before in the existence of the planet. J'accuse the United States of being in a permanent state of crime against humankind." Right, so I just want to, right, one nation that manages to lower intelligence, morality, and all human quality, not just on the territory that it controls, but on the whole planet. That's pretty bizarre and quite extreme, but that's not unique in European thinkers' views of America. So the project that I'm working on, and this is part of a book that I'm working on, is to look at the full 500 years of European philosophers' views of America. So if my time frame is huge, though, my focus is narrow. I'm not looking at any random traveler or scientists' views of America, or crackpots who have written about America, but the theorists, the philosophers, because presumably they're the ones who have the most insight. But I do try to put their views in the context of the general the views of the times. And so let me just start with a few quick definitions. What do I mean by America? In the first half of my talk, I'm meaning all of the Americas, not just the United States. And there it's talking about the Indians, right? And in the second half of my talk, I'm narrowing the focus to the United States. So it's not exactly the same America during the entire 500 years, but in changing, I'm following what America stands for to the philosophers. What do I mean by Europe? Nothing special. I'm including the United Kingdom, basically from the Atlantic to the Urals. But in different time periods, the main ideas about America are usually rooted in just one or two countries and trickle out, and everyone else kind of copies them. So I'm going to focus on some countries here and then switch around, but it's pretty much the dominant view of the time. And what do I mean by modernity? Because my argument is that what we see is, what we're going to learn is that the debates about America have really little to do with America per se, that America is a proxy in the European thinkers' own struggles for the future of European civilization, for the future of liberalism, and especially about modernity. So when I talk about modernity, I mean what political theorists mean by modernity, which is this time frame that the time period that comes out of the Renaissance and so has dominated first Europe and eventually more or less the whole world for the last 500 years. And by modernity, it's contrasted to, on the one hand, traditional societies, and traditional societies are said to be enchanted, mystical, irrational, religious, and it's contrasted to ancient and medieval political thought. And ancient and medieval political thought both thought that there was something outside man, some objective truth to which humans had to conform in order to live a happy and healthy and moral life. With modernity, that ceases to be the case. Modernity puts the emphasis on the individual and tells people to rely on themselves. And it leads to, it's characterized by the rise of instrumental and subjective reason. Different people have different views about what is driving this, but they see the same basic content to it. And modernity can be viewed in different ways, positively and negatively. Viewed positively, it allows for individual political and moral freedom, for the ability for social and self-experimentation, for science that helps us conquer nature, so we can have heat in the winter and air conditioning in the summer, and little devices that bring the best music or crappy music, as the case may be, to your ear. Viewed negatively, modernity is accused of being about the loss of horizon that gives life meaning, the loss of roots and a sense of community, a hubris that denies human limits, a hubris that denies dependence on God, an overestimation of the powers of frail and fallible human reason, that life becomes one of trivial self-indulgence, that humans lose the heroic sensibility and a taste for grandeur. And basically the point is that modernity, as with any time period or way, you can't have it all. It's hard to have stable, reassuring, rooted communities and individual freedom and self-experimentation. Because when you have the individual freedom and self-experimentation is precisely to go against the traditions of the rooted community. You can't have a technology based on science that sees everything as mere matter and motion that can be manipulated at will, and have an enchanted sacred world full of sacred beings with their own integrity. Or at least it's very hard to combine those. And so what my argument is that the arguments over America are basically arguments about modernity, what I just talked about, and reacting to those fundamental civilizational aspects that are much larger than America. And there's some reasons, there's some justification to associate America with modernity for reasons that Tocqueville and many others have talked about. Because of our lack of a feudal past, the frontiers, etc., America has more fully embodied the ideas of modernity than Europe. But what I found in looking at the full 500 years of European philosophers' views of America is 4 basic time periods, that all the views can be divided into 4 main epochal views. The first 2 have to do with the Indians, and the second 2 with the United States. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through those, give you a quick overview of that, make some conclusions, talk about some postmodern views of America, and then some final conclusions. So the first period goes from 1492 until roughly 1600. 1492, of course, is when Columbus discovers, Columbus sails to the New World. But until his dying day, Columbus thought that he had just found a new way to Asia. Right? Columbus came to the New World 4 different times, but he never thought that it was a new continent, a new world. He always thought it was Asia. The person that the map makers credit with realizing that the New World was in fact its own new continent that had not been seen before is Amerigo Vespucci. And we're named after his first name, right? The Americas, after Amerigo. If we were named after his last name, we'd be sitting in the United States of Vespuccia right now. Has a kind of ring to it. But Columbus was mistaken about the Indians as well. And basically, he never really cared much about the Indians. He doesn't show much curiosity in understanding their beliefs or institutions, but he wants to learn about them in order to manipulate them. And in Columbus, he's a very kind of odd mixture of a medieval and modern mindset. And so on the one hand, he's very modern, and he writes like an anthropologist. And so he talks about the people of the New World, and their skin is darker than the Europeans, but not as dark as Africans, and their hair is black, but it's not kinky like Africans, and right, just an anthropological description based on the facts. But at the same time as that, Columbus claims that he's found cannibals, Amazons, dog-faced people, people with tails, cyclops, and sirens. I'm not making this up. This is all in Columbus's journals. Where does this come from? Well, basically, it comes from originally a Greek historian named Herodotus, who traveled around the known world, and he reports what the legends, the stories that people tell him. And he clearly himself does not believe these stories. So he always writes, they say that, they claim that. He's distancing himself from the stories. But in the early Christian period, there's a series of encyclopedists who are trying to pull together all the knowledge about the known world, and they take those stories as if they're true, and they put them in the encyclopedia, and there's these different kinds of peoples around. And if you've ever seen maps, medieval maps, they know the Eurasian continent pretty well, and they often have islands around the Eurasian continent. It says, this is the island of the dog-faced people, this is the island of the cannibals, and things like that. So Columbus obviously believed these stories, right? Because how does this come up in conversation? He's got no common language with the natives of America, right? So how is it that that they start telling about people with dog faces? It's hard to imagine, but it's much easier to imagine Columbus saying, so, are the dog-faced people around here? And the Indians hear something that's, for what, and they point, and Columbus, oh yes, I've just found the dog-faced people. Now, to his credit, at least, Columbus never says that he actually saw any of these sort of bizarre, right? But he's just told where they are on the next island over, and he's just about to go to the cannibals and see the cannibals, but the wind changes, and so he goes in a different direction. But he reports, as if true, the discovery of these bizarre peoples. So what does this mean? It means for Columbus, the land is simply potential wealth. the people. He's not interested in their actual customs. He sees them in various times as potential converts and slaves. In fact, he writes they're intelligent, so they'll make good slaves. The point is that the Indians have no integrity, no independent status. They're there just to be used. And this is the same for all of the early explorers, Cortez, Bernal Diaz, etc. Now, for the political theorists in this time period, there's three different views that dominate the debate. And they're all located in the Spanish Renaissance. The first one, actually, though, comes from a Scottish philosopher who's writing in Paris named John Mayer, and it gets really sanctified in Spain by a guy named Juan de Sepulveda and a few others, Palacios de Rubios. And because everyone agreed that the Indians of the New World were in some sense barbaric and bizarre. And the first view is that the Indians were the concrete embodiment of Aristotle's natural slave. Now, Aristotle had come up with this idea that there were such a kind of being called natural slaves. They have no reason, and so it's good for them to be bossed around by other people, right? It's for their own good. Now, Aristotle never claimed to actually see people like that, and some people say this is Aristotle's trying to justify the conventional slavery that existed in his own times. I happen to think it's the opposite. He's marking out what is a justly held slave and what is not a justly held slave, and by his definition, all the slavery that existed in ancient Greece was unjust. But the Spanish come along and they say, the Indians are barbaric. We have just found the natural slaves that Aristotle had hypothesized but had never seen. And this leads to a policy of domination and subjugation, because if they lack reason, we can do what we will with them, of course, for their own good. But there's a problem with this view. For the Christian Renaissance that didn't exist for the pagan Greeks, and that would be that if God created a whole class of defective beings, right, why would God do that? God wouldn't create defective, an individual here or there maybe, right, but not a whole kind. So this was problematic. So this gave rise to another view, embodied in a thinker named Francisco de Vitoria, that the Indians were not natural slaves, but they were children, that they were rational, that they had language, economics, and politics, but they hadn't really developed their reason yet. And so the Spanish role would be to treat them paternalistically, like children, to help them grow up. And this view meant that the Spanish couldn't beat them, but did not have to ask for their formal consent, because they would raise the Indians, they'd bring them civilization and Christianity, and then afterwards the Indians would say, oh, thank you for having saved us from our barbarism. Now we didn't know it back then, but now that you showed us the light, we thank you for what you've done. So they give their consent at the end of the process. And the final view that dominates this period is associated with thinker Las Casas, who's a great defender of the Indians. And he says, no, the Indians are fully human, and we need their formal consent to do anything with them. But he, too, also agreed that the Indians needed civilization and Christianity. And so he was in favor of proselytizing and all of that. But you had to get their consent in doing all of this. So the point is that during this first period, all the views saw the Indians as lacking, needing Christianity and civilization. Now this changes around 1580, and the second period begins around then and goes up to the American Revolution in 1776. And I should say, for each of these periods, the views never simply go away. They continue to exist basically up until today, but a new view comes that dominates the main central debates and discourses. And this starts with Montaigne, the second period. He was a skeptic and a keen observer of human diversity, and he argued, quote, each man calls barbarism whatever is not his practice, for indeed it seems we have no other test of truth and reason than the example and pattern of the opinions and customs of the country in which we live. So unlike the Spanish, he doubted the standards of his own time and place. So you might think that would lead him to a kind of easygoing relativism. Well, we have our way, the Indians have their way, but that's not the case. Instead, he praises the Indians as better than Europe, as embodying a society so pure and natural that not even the great European philosophers had imagined something so pure. And he says that these people are wild, and the word there is sauvage, just as we call the fruits of nature that has been produced in her normal course, right? So wild, sauvage, is redefined by him to meaning natural, right? And the Europeans who have deviated from the natural way, those are the ones who are really barbaric. But even Montaigne says of the Indians that he recognizes that they fight, so his utopia still has aggression in it. They fight and they eat their prisoners, so he talks about them as cannibals. But he says in fighting, they do so for the most excusable reason possible. They don't do so for material gain, but to test themselves in a kind of manly struggle against each other, which he says is as excusable as a reason to fight, and he calls their fighting style tout noble, all noble. So here's the point. This is the creation of the noble savage. So there's something barbaric there, but there's something beautiful and noble about them as well. Now, Montaigne knows that the Indians don't actually live like the way he describes them. And we can, if in Q&A, we can go into why that is. But does this doom his project? I would argue not. That he describes the Indians inaccurately, I think just like the Spanish did, but this is the first time that they ever get good press in Europe. And what Montaigne is really interested in doing is using the Indians as a billy club against Europe, to beat Europe over the head with and say, look how we have become artificial and deviated from the natural way. Now, after Montaigne changes the whole debate in Europe about the Indians. No Enlightenment thinker ever again doubts that the Indians are the epitome of nature. But the debate switches to whether nature is a brutishness to overcome, Hobbes, or an innocence to recapture, Rousseau, Voltaire, Diderot. And the debate during the Enlightenment period amongst the philosophers unfolds in a linear direction from Hobbes and Vico, who say that the state of nature is really horrible, to Locke and Montesquieu, who say that the state of nature isn't horrible, but it's not really good either. It's got a lot of problems, to later thinkers Rousseau, Voltaire, and Diderot, who describe the state of nature as natural goodness, purity, etc. So how does one explain this changing view of America and natural man? Is it because of changes in the Indians? Are the Indians during the period from the 1600 to 1770, in fact, getting happier? No, they're being wiped out during this time period. So it's not because of actual changes by the Indians. Maybe it's because of new information about the Indians, but that's not the case either. The debates over the Indians have been caught up in polemics from the very beginning of Catholics versus Protestants. And because Spain was Catholic, the Protestants were describing the Indians as really good, and et cetera. And in truth, the major philosophers never looked at the evidence at all. From the very beginning of this time period, they knew about the Aztec and Incan civilizations, but yet they persisted in describing the Indians as living these sort of atomistic lives, individuals wandering around through the woods. So what explains the changes then? If the change isn't due to an actual change in America or reports about changes in America, the change can only be explained by something going on in Europe. And my argument is that as the philosophers in Europe became more dissatisfied with the ancien regime, the existing institutions in Europe, as they became more dissatisfied with that, they increased their praise of the Indians as some other, as an alternative, to say, look, there is something possible that we could do. And what they're doing here is they're using the Indians as part of the polemic about what a natural life would be like, and that means for them, in the state of nature, free and equal, that government has to be based on consent. And so they're using the Indians as pawns in their movement to argue for liberal modernity. So that's the second period. The third and fourth periods have to do with the United States. And the European philosophers get their way. After 100 years of calling for a new liberal kind of government against the ancien regime, one is finally set up in the United States. And so here we move from America being the home of natural man and the Indians to the home of natural rights and the American political institutions. And the initial reaction to the foundation of the United States is one of extreme enthusiasm. And so, for example, Richard Price in England says, I see the revolution in favor of universal liberty which has taken place in America, a revolution which opens a new prospect in human affairs and begins a new era in the history of mankind, right? A new era. And he says this new era will raise the species higher. He compares it to opening a new sense. So there's taste, touch, smell, sight, hearing, America. That's not quite as bizarre as it seems. I'll explain it in Q&A if you want me to. And he says that next, this is a quote, next to the introduction of Christianity among mankind, the American Revolution may prove the most important step in the progressive course of human development. So humanity is developing, and as the coming of Jesus on earth was the most important step. The American Revolution is number 2. And this is what all of the main Enlightenment philosophers at the time said. Turgot said that America is the hope of the world and a model for it. Diderot writes about in the future, people will look back at the American revolutionaries and they will say, these are the men who freed you, right? Everyone lived in chains. And these are the men who took the risk to free you, and the freedom that you enjoy is because of them. Now, they all did recognize that slavery existed in the United States, but they also understood that slavery was not the invention of the American revolutionaries that had been brought over by the European colonial powers, but they understood that it was inconsistent with American liberty, and they said that America will be judged in the expeditious way in which it gets rid of this slavery. There's a few exceptions to this at the time, Burke and some of the Scottish Enlightenment. I won't go into that. But this extreme praise of the American Revolution ends when the French Revolution starts to go bad. The French Revolution, you may know, was much less happy than ours. The French Revolution ends up in official government policy of terror, right? Terror to make you virtuous. It ends up with anarchy and dictatorship. And after the French Revolution, there's no major European thinker who ever again describes the American Revolution in anything better than ambivalent terms. And it's kind of odd, because you might say they were so praiseworthy of America, the American Revolution, and they could look and see how the French Revolution went wrong. They might have said, this is even more reason to praise the American Revolution. Not a single one did that. And instead, during the 19th century, they all had the same sort of general view about America. But let me put the 19th century in a quick kind of context. There's a historian who described it this way. Longing for the past while yearning for the future, they, Europeans, found only disenchantment with the present. A romantic poet, Alfred de Musset, described it as, everything that was is no more. Everything that will be is not yet. Look no further for the secret of our troubles. And now every age thinks of itself as obviously coming from some past and going to some future. But 19th century Europe felt this very keenly. Why? Because the whole way they had been living for 1,000 years had been fundamentally challenged by the American and French revolutions and the ideas on which they were based. And after the American and French revolutions, there was a feeling amongst the intellectuals that the world had been shaken and there was no going back. But what was yet to be, what was yet to come, was not quite there yet. And Europe throughout the 19th century has revolution after revolution in different country after different country, trying to become liberal, trying to become modern, and the old imperial powers squashing it almost every time. So what's this have to do with America? Because when Europe kept failing to institute this liberal modernity, America was out there on the horizon thriving. If it wasn't for that, I think, it would have been very easy for the European philosophers in the 19th century to say, look, this modernity, this liberalism, this isn't going to work. The French Revolution proved that. So let's just junk that and come up with some new idea. But they couldn't do that because America was out there and showing that it could exist. And so when Alexis de Tocqueville, and so America comes to represent then for the Europeans Europe's future. This is the direction in which they're heading, that they can't quite get there yet. And so when Tocqueville goes to America, he's going to the future to report back to Europe what it's going to be like. Hegel says that America is Europe's future. He means something totally different, but it's the future. The substance of what America stood for them was the following. And this is across the ideological spectrum. Self-interested individualism of the new commercial society, centralization of power by the new middle-class regime, a disorder caused by collapsing institutions, the authority of experience, age, birth, genius, talent, virtue were all questioned, a growing obsession with money, unchecked equality, and equality being preferred to liberty, and the power of the majority, and Tocqueville's famous phrase, the tyranny of the majority. Left, right, and center thinkers during the 19th century all describe America as having those characteristics. The only difference between the left, right, and the center is what they want to do about it. And so the thinkers on the far right, they want to go back to the hierarchy of church and state, of the ancien regime. They say America is indissolute individualism. We need to go back to proper order. The far left says, no, America's liberal modernity is better than the ancien regime. There's some freedom and equality in this liberal modernity, but it's not enough freedom and equality. And so they want, a more advanced version of modernity that requires some kind of revolution, socialist, communist, anarchist. And so they want to push through America to a purer vision of modernity. And it's only thinkers in the liberal center, like Tocqueville and Mill, who say, no, say America is better than the ancien regime, but they have no hope for some utopian revolution. They say America is the best it's going to get. This is the modern future. And so what we have to do is to carefully understand it and look for the good things in it to promote and the bad things in it to try to check. But look for the resources within the liberal modernity to check the bad things. And let me just mention a few quotes to illustrate this on the far left and the far right. On the far right, there's a thinker, Thomas Carlyle, who wrote, "What great human soul, what great thought, what great noble thing that one could worship or loyally admire has yet been produced in America? None. They have begotten with a rapidity beyond recorded example 18 million of the greatest bores ever seen in this world before." And it writes to his relative, "Nor should you ever consider crossing the great salt pool to the Atlantic Ocean, to plant yourself in Yankee land. That is a miserable fate for anyone at best. Never dream of it. Could you banish yourself from all that is interesting to your mind, forget the history, the glorious institutions, the noble principles of old Scotland, that you might eat a better dinner or drink more rum as a great purse-proud Yankee? And Proudhon, who is the first self-described anarchist, so on the far left, he writes of the spiritual poverty of the Americans. And he says, what if a people, but what is a people if it has no philosophy, no art, no rational ideas of law and morality? That's what the Americans are. And he says, they rank last among the nations. So that's just to give you a sense of the extreme views here. On the far left and the far right, I mean, it's crazy. No philosophy, no art, no ideas of, oh, I didn't read that, right? So, but what if, this is Proudhon's other, but what if a people, if it has no philosophy, no art, no rational ideas of law and morality? That's the way he describes America, right? No philosophy, no art, no rational ideas of law in America. He's never heard of the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution or the Federalist Papers. That was crazy. So people on the far left and the far right, they had these very extreme views that were supplied by their ideology. It had little to do with the reality of America. There's only people in the liberal center who had any interest in looking at America empirically and seeing what it actually is and what we can learn from it and what are the pluses and minuses. So quickly, the fourth period is the 20th century view of America, and it's America as technology. And the roots of this view go back into the 19th century, plenty, I won't go into that. But they see in America's technology is characterized by the mechanization of society, a modernization or leveling of the world, a loss of individuality, a decline of the spirit. Basically the same things that the 19th century complained about, except they don't say that it's because of equality or democracy per se, it's because of technology. And there's a left-wing and right-wing version of this. The left-wing version is the Frankfurt School, who says that it's because of capitalism. The right-wing version is Martin Heidegger, who says it's due to a spiritual crisis, that the technological attitude of America is one of only using the world. And we think that we're free in America because we can see a tree and we can say, we can turn that into anything, right? We're free to do anything with it. Turn it into a house or a lectern or a chair. But we're actually only free to use it. We can't imagine the tree as its own kind of being with an independent status. And what that reduces us to is mere users of things, or what he calls standing reserve. So we just have a technological attitude towards the world. And Heidegger goes so far as to say that America and Russia are metaphysically the same in embodying this, what he calls catastrophe. But when he needs just one word for it, he calls it Americanization. Okay, so let me give some quick overview. What have we seen? We've seen America condemned, praised, and condemned again, right? Condemned the Spanish Renaissance, then increasingly praised in the views of the Indians of the Enlightenment, increasingly praised even more right after the American Revolution, and at the time of the French Revolution, then we go back down until we end up as the essence of the technological morass. But during this time shift, where we go up and then back down, in terms of the value of America, America changes its symbolic importance. It goes from Europe's past. In the beginning, all the world was America for John Locke in terms of the Indians, to going to Europe's future in terms of Tocqueville. It goes from a 180-degree shift. It goes from being the epitome of nature as natural man to the epitome of technology. Again, a 180-degree shift. But I want to make 4 points about that. Despite those polar opposite shifts, first, since Columbus, European descriptions of America have been fantastical, inaccurate, and often intentionally so. Second, the technology that we're said to embody in the 20th century is there from the beginning. Columbus comes, he exploits. He doesn't see what America is. He's not interested in any kind of reality there. So the technological mindset comes from Europe, or more precisely, it's a modern phenomenon. That's not about America per se. So third, in blaming America for modernity, the European thinkers are missing the mark, that the US and modernity are not equal and identical sets. In some ways, the US is less modern than Europe, especially because we're much more religious. In other ways, at other times, Europe likes to tell us about their multinational corporations and how the GNP of the EU exceeds that of the United States. So they're plenty modern too. And finally, even though there is this fundamental polar changes, the substantive description of America stays the same despite the polar changes. And so, think of how the Indians are described, and it's more or less what European thinkers still say about the United States, right? They're brutes and naive innocents, that we're naive, innocent, childlike, simple, direct, brutish, stupid, crude, vulgar, shallow, lacking spirituality. That's what the Europeans still say of us. And so our society might be all these things. I would argue no more than most and much less than many. And if you look at the politics that have come out of Germany and France for the last century, they're pretty disgusting, and for a lot of reason to think that they're a lot worse than we are in their judgment and rationality. But if it's the fundamental same representation, substantive representation of the Indians and the United States, you know that there's a problem with the representation, right? That it's not about the reality of ways of life for the Indians in the US that are so different, that instead something else is going on. And what my argument is that it's America as the other. We are the non-Europe. And so whether we're the Indians or the United States, we play the same role, and so the same substance gets put into the categories. So let me just say give a quick epilogue, because some of you might have been reading Jean Baudrillard, a French postmodern thinker in the class of Professor Hancock and Springer. Baudrillard comes to America, and he says, well, for me, there is no truth of America, because he's a postmodern, so he doesn't believe in truth about anything. But he also says, I knew all about this nuclear form, this future catastrophe, when I was still in Paris, of course. Of course. You can be in the cafes of Paris and pontificate, and you know all there is to know about any place in the world. But Baudrillard, he basically comes to the US and he rents a car and he drives around the West, and he's like, the empty spaces, the desert, it's an abyss, nihilism, this is America. And that's a bit of a caricature, but not much. But he's also very clever, and he's very learned, and he's read all these other views of America, and so he mixes America as the future and the past, America as primitive and modern. And so he describes America as the original version of modernity, but also the perfect simulacrum, a copy. He describes it as the only remaining primitive society, the primitive society of the future. So he takes all the different images of America and kind of garbles them all up together. And, it's kind of fun, it's kind of clever, but it's not really morally serious. He does make some morally serious points, but I won't go into those right now. And I'll just say a quick word about 9/11. After 9/11, there are several postmodern philosophers who wrote about the events there. Baudrillard was one of them. And the postmodern philosophers, in order to understand what they say about 9/11, what you have to understand is that they're literary critics originally. And as literary critics, basically they believe that we're all dominated by what they call a discourse, which is some hegemonic idea that controls our minds. And we're not really free because we live inside this discourse, and it's holding us down. And the best thing you can do for someone, according to that view, is to smash their discourse, right? Because that frees them to think for their own for the first time ever. Well, they translate that view to politics. What's their political view of the world? That the world is held down by the discourse of American modernity, American capitalism, that's hegemonic. And so what should be done is that it should be smashed to free us all from American tyranny. And so Baudrillard writes about 9/11. We can say they did it, but we wished for it. What? I don't remember wishing for it. No, we all secretly wish for it because you want to smash the discourse that's holding us down. And he goes so far as to say, we can say that the horror for the 4,000 victims of dying in those towers was inseparable from the horror of living in them. What? He gives an argument, and he says that the horror of being burned alive in the Twin Towers is no worse than the horror of living in them, right? Why? Because of the air conditioning and mental conditioning that existed in the towers, right? Air conditioning is equivalent to being burned alive, and this is just crazy. And the last thinker that I'll mention is another postmodern named Slavoj Žižek. He's a postmodern from Slovenia. And he enters into this, and he describes that 9/11 as a fight as America versus the anti-modern right. The anti-modern right has two wings in Europe and the Middle East, and what it wants is what he says is capitalism without capitalism. What does that mean? It means they want the economic development that they associate with modernity, but without the social change, the cultural collapse, the permissiveness that also comes along with modernity. So we're back to where we started, right? You can't have it all. As a final conclusion here, and time is running short, I'm often asked about European philosophers, why do they dislike us so much? And the journalistic answer, if you read the newspapers, is, well, it's because of the George W. Bush administration, right? Because he went into Iraq and Afghanistan, or he didn't sign the Kyoto Treaty or go along with the International Criminal Court. But you go back into the Clinton administration, and prominent Europeans are describing American culture as a cultural Chernobyl, and Euro Disney as bombarding France with uprooted creations that are to culture what fast food is to gastronomy. If you know the role of food in France, this is a devastating criticism. And you say, well, okay, so if it's going on during the Clinton administration, it's not because of George W. Bush. Maybe it was like Vietnam. But that Monterlunk quote that I read you at the beginning, that was before Vietnam went bad. Well, maybe it was World War II when we really went into Europe. You can understand the Germans might be angry about us for that, but the French, and in fact, right after World War II, in opinion polls, the normal average Frenchman has a real 90% high approval rating of America, but amongst the elites defined by education levels, it's like 30%, right? So even though we just saved them, we're rebuilding society with the Marshall Plan and all of that, right? They're still against us. Well, maybe it was World War I when we first went into Europe. No, that it goes way back into the 19th century, before the American Civil War, and so there's no real connection between the discourse and this view and the deeds of what the United States is doing. And so it has to do not with what we do, but with what we are, or what they think we are. I have a handful of other final observations, but maybe I'll stop now so there's time for a few questions.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we'll open it up for Q&A now. Please raise your hand if you have a question and wait for the mic. That helps with the recording that will go up online later.
You talked about disenchantment with America. You talked about how the American Revolution versus the French Revolution, there was a serious disenchantment. How would you say that 9/11 has affected this disenchantment? And would you say that as a subsequent events of wars and terrorism has occurred, would you say that, and as our global hegemony diminishes, would you say that our role as a symbolic America has changed and is diminishing, or is it increasing?
Yeah, that's good. And I mean, I think as we as the United States as an actual physical power in the world goes down, you would expect that this to recede a little bit. I'm not sure that that will happen, because once this idea has been created, it continues to linger on. And so, whether reality justifies it or not. So what happens is like when, in the lead up to the second Iraq War in the George W. Bush administration, there were legitimate policy issues to be discussed. And Europe had one view and the United States had another view. But in that confrontation, there's this legacy of 500 years of imagery on America that just spilled out in this kind of bilious way, and that made the actual policy difference that much harder to deal with. And so I think that this, I think that's one of the main legacies of this, and I don't expect that to ever really go away. That would be my guess, or not for a long time. And so if I was advising policymakers, my advice to them would be to be aware of this residue of anti-Americanism. And whenever there is some conflict between us and Europe, that this is going to come out and complicate things. But I'll also say, as long as the United States and Europe are fundamentally modern and share that and are more like each other than anywhere else in the world, that will keep us together, and I expect that will keep us together. But since Europe fancies that it's a sort of a later, more sophisticated version of modernity than us, socialistic and caring and loving and pacific, right? They praise themselves for all of that, even though when there's genocide in Serbia, the former Yugoslavia, they can't do anything about it because they don't have troops and the U.S. has to go in and do something about it, right? And that leads to, so as long as we have different versions of modernity, that there will, and relative differences in power between us, and this gets back to your question, relative, as long as we're more powerful than Europe, they will still resent our power and resent their dependence on our power. And so this will never go away, I don't think, as long as that exists.
I see that you have written down about immigrants literature. I was specifically wondering what role the perceived America had on influencing European immigration.
Yeah. So this goes along with the general divide between the European elites and the European masses. And the European masses basically always love America, and more or less still do. And, and they react to us in a commonsensical way. And so, when we do bad things in the world, among mass European opinions, we go down, we do something else, and we go back up, right? As opposed to the European elites, where there's just a steady low line, regardless of what we do. And so the literature, the immigrants' literature, is for the masses, right? For the poor, downtrodden people who have no hope, no life in Europe, right? Who have no rights, who didn't have the right to own property in many cases, not able to vote, ethnic discrimination, racial discrimination, and the lives of most people in Europe for most of the, was pretty miserable. And so the immigrant literature is a hopefulness. That's where you see the America with streets paved with gold. Now, interestingly, there's two sort of variations of the immigrants literature. Some is by actual immigrants and people hoping to leave, and some more cynically are by the people who own the boats. Right? And they're the ones who often are coming up with real positive images of America because they want to sell boat tickets for people to leave Europe and go to the New World. So,
I have a question about the concept of standing reserve and technological thinking within Heidegger and that's effect on the United States. It seems like in the United States there's a stronger strain of anti-environmentalism than there is in Europe, and this is especially manifested with the a lot of doubt about the science of global warming that's taken hold in the United States. Do you think that is evidence that technological thinking is more deeply rooted in the United States, the sort of idea that we're offended by the idea that there might be any effect or retaliation by nature of all of our modernizing, or is that just illustrative of deeper political differences?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'd say to the limited extent of what you pointed to are doubts about global warming and things like that, are relatively greater doubts about global warming compared to Europe, could be a sign of that, the lack of the penetration of the technological idea. But on the other hand, the U.S., we were the first to create national parks, right? These reserves for nature, right? Also, so right, this is the loving of nature, and that kind of goes along with the environmentalism, right? That the other thing that you were talking about cuts against. I was out in Utah 15 months ago with my wife. We went to all 5 national parks in Utah, so that goes along with that. But I guess I would just say there's different threads, right? No culture is, on the level of your question, no culture is monolithic. There's different threads in the culture, and the same thread kind of goes both ways at different times in what it emphasizes.
I'm curious about you've mentioned amongst the elites and their views of America. You repeatedly mentioned the French, and I'm wondering if it's more universal than that. Is it all elites, or are there particular elites? For instance, are there elites with fascist tendencies that are critical of America? I'm thinking Quebec in Canada, it always had a fascist, anti-Semitic element, and it's been critical of America where the rest of Canada hasn't. And so I'm wondering if this is a French thing, or if it's European. Is it European or is it fascist?
Yeah, so good. Let me separate that into two things about whether it's French or universal. And it's more universal than just the French. I happen to know the opinion polling in France, and it's so surprising after World War II as I cite it. But it's also across the board in Germany, in England as well. Those 3 main countries I know. But you're absolutely right that there is a fascistic side of this. And so one of the conclusions that I left out at the end is whether it's just sort of the left in Europe that dislikes America. And it turns out that's not the case. That since World War II, that's predominantly the case, but that's really accidental because the intellectual right was totally discredited by fascism and supporters of fascism. But the intellectual right before World War II, in the interwar period and going back into the 19th century with Nietzsche, Muller-Vandenbroek, Spengler, is also very anti-American. And so the chic radical left after World War II basically just adopts wholesale the cultural critiques of the right, fascist right, before World War II. I've never seen any evidence that they're aware of that connection. I think that if they knew that, they'd be embarrassed. Maybe that's why they don't mention it. I do take great pleasure in the manuscript, though, in pointing this out. There's a question in the back. Oh, you got one here. Okay. Yeah.
I was just going to point out there's a book called Ni droite ni gauche about intellectuals in the 30s, and I forget the guy's name, Zeev Sternhill,
Right.
Who makes the argument that they're basically the two extremes meet at the extremes.
Yeah, and that's his interpretation of fascism in particular, right?
But also the two
Yeah.
intellectual traditions of right and left.
Yeah.
That they're
exactly.
modern economy.
Right. And what it is, exactly, and so this goes back to my thesis about America representing modernity, and it's a liberal modernity. There's different versions of modernity, and America is sort of first wave capitalist, separation of public and private modernity. But then you get, later on, you get a socialist, right, that thinks of it that as a more refined vision, and you get a reactionary right. And both of those look at America representing first wave modernity, and they criticize it for not being, well, not being enough for the left and being too much for the right.
I'm just going to mention the most obvious instance of this sort of at the philosophical level of this migration from right to left is simply the influence of Heidegger in post-war
Yeah.
French philosophy.
Right.
So over the line between Heidegger and Sartre and everything that Derrida, for that matter,
Right, no,
everybody.
absolutely, and the French seemed shocked that Heidegger was a Nazi, right? You know, the whole affair Heidegger in the 80s.
With the European-American comparison, it seems like there's always it breaks down in kind of a false dichotomy that the United States is really such a vastly different country in structure and in politics than any country in the world, you could arguably say. I mean, it's like France is a nation state, and the United States is a super state. And like Florida, it'd be better to go about comparisons of Florida to France, or California to France, or Texas to France, than anyway, with Europeans,
Texas thinks of itself as a nation state.
Well, it is. It's the Republic of Texas. It's on its flag, but well, I mean, it's on its flag. But I was just wondering, with European thought, when in conversation with Europeans, I find that rarely do they get really the scale of the United States. That they think the United States is another France, and they talk about in terms, and they don't really understand how like Utah is different than New York or that. And I don't know, does that ever come up, or I mean, do you just have to spend a day driving across Kansas to get it?
Yeah, it doesn't come up too much, right? So there's not sophisticated empirical treatments of the United States, of New York, or the culture of the two coasts and versus the middle or something, right? That the philosophers are not interested in America on that level. It's a much more symbolic thing. But I really agree with what you said at the beginning, that it's often portrayed as a kind of a false dichotomy, as if Europe and America are so totally different. But I think that and you pointed to ways in which we are different, but there are ways in which we're fundamentally the same, and we come out of the same intellectual tradition. And when the European philosophers criticize America, I think what they're really doing is criticizing the arguments made by earlier European philosophers and statesmen who argued for what America became and instituted, and what Europe tried to become and tried to institute and failed. And now it's sort of wrestling with what it is. And the criticisms of America are criticisms about themselves and where they've been and these ideas in Europe. And I think they use America to try to put some distance between themselves and their own past. So instead of saying the problems that we have in Europe are because of previous decisions we've made, it's easier in a way to say, no, these problems come from the outside, and see it as an external force coming, right? And in a certain way, I don't begrudge them that. Okay, if they want to deal with their own problems and it helps them to create some space for them to deal with those problems, within which they can deal with those problems, that's fine. But by saying that it's America, it sets up this whole polemic and creates a wedge across the Atlantic. And if they would just say, look, the problem is modernity, well, there's plenty of people, plenty of thinkers in the United States who also have issues with modernity. And you can have some kind of transatlantic dialogue about dealing with modernity. But that's not the way they... So in my book, I try to make an appeal to them to to do that, to call a spade, and, make it modernity that you're really arguing about and not America. But I don't expect they'll change.
An example of that is actually the Ku Klux Klan is named Ku Klux Klan because they wanted to reference their Scottish heritage.
Huh,
And
I didn't know
the
that.
Confederate flag uses St. Andrew's cross just like the Scottish flag.
Huh.
As well.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, but
I was going to actually follow up on his point. I think one of the things that happens in the French intellectual class and also in the press is a certain reductionism when they talk about, say, American justice. When they were talking about the DSK, Dominique Strauss-Kahn example, the perp walk is a New York thing more than anywhere else. I mean, it does exist elsewhere, but it really is a sort of a New York phenomenon. And they talk about New York justice as if it's American justice. Or there was another example I had in mind. A few years back when
They're not too happy with Texas justice either.
yeah. Oh, that's another example is the death penalty. They like to point to Americans as barbarians because we have the death penalty, but not realizing that we have it in some states and not in others.
Right.
So I guess the point is they don't really understand federalism.
Yes.
They think of the U.S. as a kind of monolithic state as France is, and that it's run from the center, and that the president can intervene in affairs of justice and sort of arrange things. This came up with Roman Polanski as well, right? Somehow this is the president running the show here rather than the LA County prosecutor.
Yeah.
Then they just don't really get that.
No, that's true. They really do not get American federalism. And my favorite sort of anecdote about that, you have some nice ones that you just mentioned, but when the Europeans were writing the European Constitution that was turned down by people, the different countries, the person in charge of that commission of writing the European was Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, right? And Giscard d'Estaing said that he wanted to be to the European Constitution what Thomas Jefferson was to the American Constitution, right? Now, those in the know laugh because Jefferson had nothing to do with the American Constitution. Jefferson was in Paris when the American Constitution was written. So, in fact, Giscard d'Estaing got his wish. He was to the American Constitution. But this is the kind of But this is the kind of ignorance about the United States and federalism in particular. And Europe is wrestling with the question of federalism. Nowhere has federalism been as successful as in the United States. You'd think that it would occur to them to actually know something about the practice and ideas of American federalism, but clueless.
We were talking about the variety of America and federalism that the writers tend to overlook. I was reminded that Baudrillard, in fact, he travels and he talks about the desert in the West and the skyscrapers in New York, but he makes them two figures of the same thing. You have the horizontal desert and the vertical desert. It's just it's a great interpretive virtuosity that he performs there just to make them part of the same phenomenon. I think there's probably nothing very urgent that remains, and our time is short, so please join me in thanking Professor Levine.